Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really dark, deeply psychological thriller hidden right inside ancient Norse mythology. We're talking about the legendary story of Fenrir, the giant wolf destined to devour a god. But we're not just going to look at this as some dusty old fairy tale. Nope. We're going to decode the underlying architecture of fate itself and discover how pure, unadulterated paranoia fundamentally shaped one of mythology's greatest monsters.
Right off the bat, let's start with this chilling question that frames our entire analysis today. Did the gods create the monster they feared? It's your classic chicken and egg scenario, but, well, with literal apocalyptic stakes. We usually tend to think of monsters as these beasts that are just born inherently evil, right? But our sources today ask us to totally flip that assumption on its head. We're going to see how suspicion and this completely desperate desire for control can literally breed the exact destruction we try so hard to avoid.
All right, Section 1, the architecture of fate, understanding the inevitable.
To really understand Fenrir as a monster, we first have to examine the incredibly claustrophobic concept of fate that governed the Norse gods themselves. And actually, it's pretty wild, because this brings us to a very modern psychological concept, the self-fulfilling prophecy. This is basically when a prediction causes itself to become true simply because of the actions people take trying to stop it. And guys, this concept is the absolute one-to-one blueprint for Fenrir's tragedy. The gods were so terrified of a predicted future that their defensive maneuvers actually paved a superhighway straight to their own doom.
It all kicks off with a fate decided at birth. When the gods looked at the children of Loki, they didn't see innocent kids. No, they saw a terrifying destiny that was already written in stone. Before Fenrir ever bared a single fang or growled a threat, he was condemned. I mean, just imagine the psychological toll of that. Being judged and completely sentenced, not for anything you've actually done, but for what people are utterly convinced you're going to do.
Moving on to Section 2, the children of chaos, exile and paranoia.
So how did the gods actually react to this overwhelming fear? Well, they ended up tearing a family completely apart. And there's a really stark contrast in the fates of Loki's children. Hel is exiled out of sight to the dark underworld. Jormungandr, the great serpent, is chucked away into the deep ocean. But Fenrir? He's kept right there in Asgard. Think about that. They threw the snake in the ocean, put the girl in the underworld, but kept the literal apocalypse dog right in their own living room. They thought they were keeping their enemy close, but really, they were just cultivating a captive audience for their own paranoia. And this created an incredibly toxic tension in Asgard. On one side, you have the god's paranoia, just constantly watching this wolf grow, totally fueled by fear of his lineage. But on the other side, think about Fenrir's reality. He's growing up completely isolated, stripped of his siblings, and surrounded by captors rather than a family. The god's constant flinching and their little whispers slowly shaped the wolf's entire worldview. Day by day, he was actively being taught that he was a threat, an outsider, and ultimately, the enemy.
Which brings us to Section 3, binding the beast, escalating the betrayal.
As Fenrir's physical power grew to match the gods' paranoia, that fear hit a terrifying tipping point. They shifted from passive suspicion to active, cruel betrayal. First, they try lading, playing it off to the wolf as a fun game of strength, which, of course, he easily shatters. Panicking, they forge Dromi, a much stronger chain, which he breaks with a simple kick. So finally, they resort to Gleipnir, this deceptive, impossibly thin, magical ribbon. And to get this one on him, they literally have to manipulate his pride and lie to his face. Every single failed chain wasn't just a physical restraint. It was a mounting psychological betrayal explicitly telling the wolf, "We want to break you."
And so he truly became a monster forged in chains. By finally binding him with Gleipnir, leaving him trapped and gagged with a sword wedged in his mouth, the gods didn't neutralize a threat. No way. They just cemented his absolute hatred. The real tragedy here is that up until the very moment he was irrevocably bound, Fenrir hadn't actually harmed the gods. The violence was completely initiated by his captors. In their desperate attempt to tie down the monster they feared, the gods themselves picked up the hammer that forged his fury.
Section 4, the wolf unleashed, the chaos before creation.
All of this ultimately sets the stage for a catastrophic climax, and looking at this timeline, you can just feel the agonizing weight of time. We start with those early years, raised in captivity and deep suspicion within Asgard. Then an indeterminate number of centuries bound in total silence, nursing a growing and honestly a pretty justified vengeance. Finally, the end of days, where he is unleashed at Ragnarok to devour the very gods who chained him. Every single second Fenrir spending those chains was a second spent planning his revenge against his abusers.
His ultimate rampage is perfectly described by this quote, avenging the chaos before creation. You see, Fenrir's role at Ragnarok wasn't just mindless, unthinking destruction. It was deeply personal. It was a brutal settling of a massive cosmic score. He represented the wild, untamable forces of chaos taking their ultimate revenge on the very authorities who had unfairly suppressed them right from birth.
Let's wrap this up with Section 5, a self-fulfilling prophecy, the architects of ruin.
So, let's bring it all together to answer our initial question about the true villain of this myth. The tragic irony is just screaming at us in the massive gap between the gods' intentions and their outcome. Their intention was simple, right? Bind the wolf to prevent Ragnarok and save themselves. But the outcome? They created an unstoppable, vengeful force that absolutely guaranteed their destruction. In their desperate attempt to cheat fate, the gods became the primary architects of their own doom. I mean, if they hadn't chained him, he wouldn't have had a reason to seek world-ending revenge in the first place.
Ultimately, the fear was the real poison here. It wasn't the wolf's inherent nature that sealed Asgard's fate. It was the gods' paranoid, hostile response to his mere existence. Their obsessive fear of his lineage completely blinded them to the creature standing right in front of them, turning a potential ally, or at least, a neutral party, into their deadliest, most highly motivated enemy.
I'm going to leave you with this final, really haunting thought to chew on. If the gods had chosen compassion over fear, would the wolf have ever become a monster? What you should really take away from this explainer is that the way we treat the unknown and how we respond to our own anxieties, well, it has profound consequences. Reconsider everything you thought you knew about monsters, because a lot of the time the real danger isn't the beast in the shadows, but the people holding the chains. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the architecture of the stories we tell.